Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Profoto. Profoto, the light-shaping company, renowned for its high-end lighting equipment used by the world's best photographers and brands, has now expanded into the world of cinematography with uncompromising speed of use and limitless creativity. The L1600D is a high-output with no ballast LED light. Its dual mount makes it compatible with 50-plus Profoto modifiers and hundreds of Bowen's mount modifiers, making it a breakthrough product for cinematographers and gaffers seeking speed and efficiency on set with the highest degree of creative light-shaping possibilities. This episode is sponsored by Aperture and its new Storm XT52, the industry's most powerful LED point source light. Brighter than a 6K HMI and powered by Aperture's revolutionary Blair light engine, the Storm XT52 is both a tunable white light and also the brightest ever adjustable color LED. Storm XT52, unrivaled output, only from Aperture. Today we're speaking with an author. His most recent book, The Golden Hour, offers a fascinating historical look at the changes in the film business over his lifetime. He grew up in films with a father who was an agent and a screenwriter mother. His insights are riveting, and we're very pleased to welcome Matthew Specktor. Matthew, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, that's right. You're doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor. This is a great podcast.
Well, our first question is always, how did you get to where you are today? Of course, we who have read the book know, but why don't you, for the people that are listening and may not have read your book yet, because I'm sure they will eventually, tell us how you got to where you are today.
I actually had a very kind of crooked and unusual path, only because I grew up, as you noted, my father was and still is a talent agent, and he's been that for 70 years. And my mother was a screenwriter, so there were two, and my mother was really kind of a frustrated novelist, I think, frustrated fiction writer. So there were these two kind of powerful strands that were exerting their, kind of magnetism on me when I was growing up. One was, of course, the world of Hollywood and the deal, and the other was the world of my mother's world, which was much more focused on art and literature. And so, even when I was a teenager, I was, on the one hand, had a summer job working in my dad's office, and I was reading screenplays and doing coverage. And I was 15 years old. I was sort of a little bit of an in-house wonderkind, I guess. But I was also kind of having my own kind of creative impulses, a desire to write less for the movies, to write prose. And I think that was also kind of conditioned by the fact that my mother, I observed in my mother a kind of unhappiness that I see in screenwriters a lot, because because most of what they do, they don't have any control over. So I broke that way. I decided I wanted to write novels initially. And at the same time, I was offered a job working for Robert De Niro. This was in my early 20s. I was asked if I wanted to move to New York to work for Bob and to read books and see plays and sort of look for things that could be adapted. And I remember just thinking, I can't believe that's a job. How could that possibly be a job? It was invented for me. It was like I could work inside the movie business, but not have to sort of be as interred in it as people in Los Angeles can be. It is a kind of very insular culture that did not appeal to me in that way. But I could also go and sort of spy on the world of publishing without having to work in publishing, which seemed like a bad idea for an author. So I wound up working for Bob and having a series of jobs in sort of development. And I worked for a studio, and I became a fairly senior executive pretty quickly, probably because I wasn't afraid to get fired. I think it's that end of the business is so loaded with people who are constantly hedging and, sort of acting defensively. And I always sort of thought, like, what's the worst thing I'm going to what's going to happen? I'm going to get fired. Like I would have something, there's something else I want to do anyway. You know, I can't possibly get fired soon enough.
Very healthy.
I did do that. Yes. And eventually I was fired, very, very gently, actually. My boss, she didn't so much fire me. She said, listen, if you'd like to come to Los Angeles and work for me and work for 20th Century Fox, you can do that, but I don't really need a New York office anymore. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And shortly thereafter, I was offered a chance to adapt a novel I really loved as a screenwriter, a book called The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard. You know, I was hired to do that, and then that kind of launched my career as a screenwriter. So, you know, I sort of have passed through the whole digestive tract of the motion picture industry, or at least as it was, you know, in the sort of pre-streaming, pre-internet era, and kind of learned to see that the development process, you know, the above the line process, from a number of angles, which is really which I found and still find pretty fascinating.
I was interested in a couple of places you credit James Baldwin as being an inspiration to your writing, but on the other side, you also credit Scott Fitzgerald, and it's interesting what you're saying about Hollywood, because Fitzgerald was kind of destroyed by Hollywood, wasn't he, when he became a screenwriter?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Fitzgerald was my first literary love when I was 14 or 15. It was reading him that really electrified me, and I feel like, you know, that was always the understanding. I think the popular story about Fitzgerald is that he came to Hollywood and wrote scripts and they weren't very good, and that kind of wrecked him. I'm not sure that that's entirely true. You know, I think what wrecked him was alcohol. And he did come out and write. I mean, the first couple scripts he wrote were just awful, but he did improve at it, and it wasn't something that he did out of desperation. He had a desire to make movies, which tends to get left out of the equation. You know, one thing that I hadn't known until fairly recently was that even when he wrote the original version of Tender as the Night, Dick Diver, the protagonist, was meant to be a film director. And I think, you know, so, you know, and I will always maintain that The Last Tycoon, the book he was working on when he died, would have been, I think, his best novel. I actually prefer it, even in its unfinished form, to The Great Gatsby or whatever. But, you know, Fitzgerald was one thing. And then when I went off to university, James Baldwin was my writing professor, which obviously it still shocks me to this day. It seems somehow perverse that he would have been, you know, teaching undergraduates in, you know, at a little college in Western Massachusetts. I say shocks me because I think it's, you know, just seems far beneath his station, let's say. I mean, he was a great man, I mean, one can't even say inspiration. I mean, he was an astonishment to me. It was like sitting at the foot of a god. But even he, I didn't know this actually until much later. Even he had, you know, I was interested, particularly in the golden hour, in sort of the ways that Hollywood and the movies in the late 20th century touched everybody, right? I mean, even people who you don't think of as having had any kind of involvement with the movies did, and Baldwin certainly did. I mean, he wrote a wonderful and very incisive book about film called The Devil Finds Work. But he also tried to write scripts and did write scripts and really wanted to be produced his entire life, which is also something I just found fascinating.
I think it's also interesting that in the 60s and 70s, movies were so much more a part of people's lives, because when a movie came out, you can refer to a movie from that time and pretty much figure that everybody knows what you're talking about, unless they're young. But nowadays, if you refer to a movie, it's a very select people who will know maybe what movie you're talking about, while others will know a different movie. It's not the same. Like Wizard of Oz, everybody knows Wizard of Oz,
Right.
and this and that. Jaws, everybody knows Jaws, you know.
Right. Even my child, who's 21 years old, knows those things. I mean, it's true. Movies in the 20th century were, you know, they were a kind of cultural currency. They were something that people shared. They were something that people experienced together in a room, which I think is the loss of that is really something awful. And I think, obviously there are still movies that sort of become cultural events, Barbie or Sinners or whatever, and but they don't seem personal in that way. I mean, movies used to we used to be able to take them very personally, and I'm not sure that people take them personally, not that kind of personally anymore.
You talk at length in Always Crashing about 5 Easy Pieces, actually, with Bob Rafelson and Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
You knew Jack Nicholson when you were a young kid, and 5 Easy Pieces is one of my favorite movies, and I was absolutely blown away with it by having a chance to work with Bob Rafelson on a film called Mountains of the Moon.
Yes.
And lovely man. I loved it. He had a reputation, but I found him what a wonderful man.
Yes.
And you say that you refer to films like Barbie and Nora and others that they don't fulfill the role that something like 5 Easy Pieces did, which was actually a reflection of the middle class, a life that is much more, for the majority of us, more of a reality than a Nora or Barbie, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, it was just not. I'm not trying to insult a Nora or Barbie. It so much has to do. It so much has to do with a kind of a cultural context, and also because a film like 5 Easy Pieces, which really is a masterpiece, and so is King of Marvin Gardens, which I think doesn't get nearly as much attention, but that's a fabulous film too. And I think there was something about the way that those films were a little closer to the counterculture, and were, of course, set off by so many other. There's something about having a film like that emerge from a kind of just broader field of films that are being put out every week. It gives it a kind of a context or a shape that I think movies today don't quite get to possess. They're sort of they're fired off as these kind of precisely marketed, sort of commercially oriented events. And, even something like Nora, which I think is a movie that aspires to be, art, right? That it's not trying to be a blockbuster. It's trying to be a personal story, but it somehow doesn't have that kind of ambiguous, kind of interiority that I think 5 Easy Pieces does. I think that sense of kind of having to experience this kind of very idiosyncratic character in a way. The Nicholson figure in that movie, he's everybody in that movie, but he's a very tough character to take. He's an asshole, for want of a better word, and but he's also just the most. You're so enveloped in his story and so devastated by what becomes of him. It's incredible.
There's kind of part of you in it. That's the thing, isn't it? There's part of everybody in that character. You can understand his frustration at saying, a chicken sandwich. That scene in the restaurant. And you just, it's part of you somehow.
Do you think that part of this happened because movies became a way of making a huge profit if done in a certain formula, as opposed to if they make a certain amount of money, it's okay. But now they're looking for that.
I absolutely do. I think that kind of blockbuster mentality, something happened, and it really started to happen in the 90s, because I think even though the kind of apotheosis of it was the 70s, I think well through the 80s, the kind of median movie, most movies were still about kind of people with kind of human-sized dilemmas, right? With their families, with their sort of, relationships and so on. And I think, when the studios really pivoted in the 90s, when kind of everybody's salaries went way up. I remember when I was working for De Niro, there was a day that the studio decided to pay Jim Carrey $20 million to do The Cable Guy, and it was an unheard of amount of money. And it was right around then that I think the movies really even the ones that weren't yet tent poles, there weren't quite Marvel movies yet or anything, but there were sort of like the Die Hard movies, the sort of the earlier Michael Bay movies, these sort of, movies about disasters, Twister and Volcano, and it's sort of this sense of kind of apocalyptic spectacle and or sort of very broad comic conceit, like the Farrelly Brothers or something. These kind of movies that you could look at and you could be entertained by them, but you wouldn't really see people in them. I mean, people meaning people like yourself or oneself, and that I think is where it really started to slip away. And I think it's also no accident that was sort of the moment that, neoliberal economics kind of swallowed the globe. I think those two things are tied, and we're still trying to recover from it in some way.
And also, if so much money is on the line, you're going to take the safe route. In other words,
Correct.
You're going to explain everything. You're not going to leave anything ambiguous because some people wouldn't like that. You're going for the largest audience.
Yes, and honestly, I mean, it was something that that's not hard to understand. I mean, maybe it's become a little harder to understand again because these corporations have so much money that I mean, back in the 90s, if it was still the idea that if a studio could be bankrupted by one enormous flop, right?
Right.
None of these companies now are going to be Heaven's Gate, or I was at Universal when Waterworld came out. It wasn't bankrupted, but it was. Right. It was like that kind of was a big factor in the studio being sold. And it was a devastation. And I think that, these places can take the hit now. So you'd think they would be willing to take some risks, but they're not because shareholders.
Yeah. It's interesting. You also say that the high watermark of the 70s filmmaking were Hal Ashby's coming home and being there. I find that really interesting. Do you think those films could be made these days? I mean, was it just by chance somebody like Hal Ashby, by all accounts, a good guy and a sort of old hippie?
Yes.
Do you think anybody like that could actually succeed in Hollywood today?
Well, look, those are wonderful films. I'm a huge Hal Ashby film. I do think that there are probably, I don't know, I mean, there were better films than that, but even better films than that I can think of that were made during the 70s. But I think what's interesting there is, Ashby really did have an astonishing run, because I think between The Landlord and Being There, there were a couple that maybe Bound for Glory isn't quite as good, but every movie he made, there were about 8 movies he made that were all fantastic. And then after that, he made about a half dozen movies that are all pretty much unwatchable. It was a very strange way that his career broke. It was as if he kind of lost his touch. And this is a tangent that I don't want to get lost in, but I sometimes think that there's a certain kind of, that being able to make a comedy, being able to sustain your kind of comedic balance, that is the hardest medium, the hardest form, the hardest genre to sustain excellence. Even in more recent memory, I think of people like, I don't know, James L. Brooks or Cameron Crowe, whose movies were sort of wonderful, and then something kind of broke in them, and they became a little less so. The thing is, I do think, I mean, again, I don't know that I quite put this on the same level as Ashby, but I think a film like The Holdovers is so blatantly, which I think is both a very good movie and also, is, I mean, it wants so badly to be a Hal Ashby movie. It's like one of those bands that sounded like the Beatles. You're like, oh man, this is as close to the Beatles as I'm ever going to get without actually listening to the Beatles. And it did get made, right? But it didn't. But I would say again that lack of context or something else. There's some sense that it doesn't reach the same level. It doesn't quite feel like someone is. I mean, I do love that movie, but I think it's not. There's that sense of discovery is not the same, right? Those Ashby movies had that wonderful sense of discovery and that wonderful balance of, a kind of countercultural, not perversity, but a kind of, willingness to kind of, throw up their middle finger at social conventions, and at the same time, a very gentle, deeply humane spirit, right? I mean, I think, Harold and Maude, a perfect example of a film that's just perfect. I took my daughter to see it a year or two ago when she was 19, and it's her favorite film. She couldn't believe it. She was so in love with it. It's a movie that really travels, and I think all of those early Ashby movies do.
Yeah, I wonder if some of these films were more available or were re-released, whether people would find them again, realize how great that period of filmmaking was, the 60s, 70s.
I know.
I'm gonna just read something now because
how does it feel being quoted, in your book, from your book?
Yeah, no,
aren't you sorry you said all these things?
No, in your book you mentioned 1969, and you're talking about Eleanor and Frank Perry and a film called Last Summer. The same year it came out was Midnight Cowboy. This is in Always Crashing in the Same Car. But then my favorite year of all filmmaking, I think, is 1969. And I just want to mention a number of credits. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Wild Bunch, Z, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Women in Love, Kes, Easy Rider, Army of Shadows, my favorite film of all time, McKenna's Gold, Oh, What a Lovely War, The Dam, The Color of Pomegranates, The Bed Sitting Room, The Rain People, Fellini's Satyricon, Medium Cool, Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here, which is a wonderful movie, The Red Tent, among many, but also Marcel Ophuls' The Sorrow and the Pity. Can you imagine that year?
No, I really can't. I mean, that is an astonishing. My God, like you could watch those movies. You could see each of those movies, 8 or 10 times, and you could cover every night of the year that way. It's really something, and that is 1969. A lot of those movies, in fact, all of those movies, because I was 2 years old in 1969. I saw later, and many of them with my mother, who, when I was a teenager, was very intent on, she just loved nothing better than to take me to see the movies that really knocked her and my father out when they were young parents. And it was I mean, I am very wary in general of kind of becoming nostalgic or sort of trying to people always say, oh, it was those were the days, it was so much better when. But it's pretty hard to argue that cinema really did achieve a kind of certainly it had many peaks, right? I mean, there are other years that are very dear to my heart, both before then and after that. But I think sometimes I remember being somewhat shocked in kind of the last 10 years to discover that people consider 1999 to be a great year in American cinema, because there were some certainly I look back and I think, oh yeah, well, there were some that it was better than, I don't know, 1995, but it was not 1969. You really can't, I worked in the business in 1999. I know exactly what was made, and it was not, the environment was not comparable. It wasn't close.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically, why the change? The change is the change in the studios, the change in the environment.
Yeah, I think 1969, right there, 68, 69, 70, 71, all the way until about, I think by 75, 74, 75, the bloom was coming pretty well off the rails. And then, of course, you had Jaws and Star Wars, and that changed everything. But I think that era, you had several factors in play, right? Because there was a generational turnover that was happening. You had, Easy Rider is, of course, the most famous example, right? But Bert Schneider, who was, who produced that movie, was one of the three people who did. He was the son of the guy who ran Columbia, right? And so, and he was sort of, and he was like a lot of young people at that time, very, very political, very, very, very left wing. Was giving money to the Black Panthers, and Dennis Hopper wandered into his office, and Dennis was at that time a crazy person. I don't think it's too much to say that. And asked for $1.5 million, and they said, "Sure, go." And which obviously, I mean, it's like there have been other times in Hollywood where moguls have offered writers and directors a similar amount of personal freedom. That's not unprecedented, and it didn't take a kind of maniac to do it. But that movie struck such a chord and was such a hit, and happened at exactly the moment it did, which was a moment of sort of enormous cultural and political and generational questioning. Kind of cracked the door open so that for a little while, filmmakers and actors and writers were able to, I don't want to say run riot, because as much as I'm the writer. I think writers and directors should be allowed to do whatever they want. But I also know from experience that that's very rarely does sort of untrammeled carte blanche work out all that well. You mentioned the Rain people, and I went last year to see Megalopolis in a theater, and mostly what I thought was that was no great help to Francis that nobody was there to say no to him or to challenge his ideas. And because I just think artists need that. Everything I've ever written has had an editor who came to me at some point and said, "I think you should take this bit out," and it's usually something I don't want to take out, and they're usually correct. It's sort of, I do think that there's a kind of dialectic that is invaluable for artists. But that relative freedom was so generative at that moment, and that moment, that time has not come again. There was, of course, the moment in the early 90s where you had, the next generation of filmmakers. You had Paul Thomas Anderson at Quentin, and Wes Anderson and Noah Baumbach, and that, and so Steven Soderbergh. That was also a pretty dynamic era. But even then, those movies were somewhat siloed. I mean, obviously Pulp Fiction was not, but they didn't have quite the same cultural range because they were, considered independent, and sort of they were always sort of working in the shadow of these kind of big, more expensive blockbusters, instead of doing what a movie like Easy Rider or what those movies in 1969 did, which was make all the kind of spectacle movies that the studios were making in the 60s, Cleopatra and all, and Lawrence of Arabia and all that. They made them look corny. Right? Yeah.
So if the studios have changed to a degree, do you think the audience has changed too in what they want? Or, I mean, because they're not brought up to expect much, it doesn't seem like.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, do I think that they've changed in what they want? I do. Do I think that they have changed in what they're even available for the most part to receive? What they're kind of capable of absorbing? Yeah, I do. I mean, and I think there are kind of reasons for that. Again, other cultural reasons. I think the internet has really done a lot to our attention spans and our kind of comfort with ambiguity and what it's okay to say and depict. And and in some cases, I think that might be for the better. But it's so there's that. But then I think to myself, there's still. I always think of something that John Cassavetes said somewhere. This was I've been looking for it, and I think it's in a book or it's something he did with the writer Michael Ventura, who I think wrote a book about spending time with Cassavetes, and he said something along the lines of, he said, look, there's a difference between what people want and what people need, and he said, I'm not interested in giving people what they want. I'm trying to give them what they need, and you have to sort of of course we take for granted in some sense that that Cassavetes was a phenomenal filmmaker, but those movies were not successful. They had a hard time, commercially they had a hard time, and he just went ahead and made them anyway. And I think that kind of mindset, there are still. I still believe that filmmakers are capable of that, and that there are some filmmakers who are doing it. I mean, I think Jane Schunbrun's movies, I saw the TV Glow and We're All Going to the World's Fair. Those are, just to kind of pluck an example out of thin air. Like, those are very inventive movies. They are not like other films. They're the product of an original sensibility, and I think a kind of profound talent. And I'm not saying that Schunbrun is Francis Coppola or Scorsese or whatever. It's she's it's also fairly early in her career, but I think there's a kind of just one example of a filmmaker who is making movies in a very personal way, and so I do believe that's still possible, and not just possible. I mean, I think, again, that distinction between what we want and what we need. I mean, the fact is, what we probably need now more than we ever did, because there's so little of it.
Yeah.
How do you talk in golden hour very much? I mean, from the inside, because your father, Fred Specktor, still works at CAA, and you talk a lot about Lew Wasserman and how the whole industry changed from being, I suppose, guided by high-powered producers to be guided by the agents.
Yeah, I mean, that was in many ways something that became very clear to me when I was thinking about the book and kind of wanting to, I was very interested in the way that the kind of locus of power moved around the business and settled in different spots, right? Because it began, when Hollywood began, it was with the studios. The studio bosses were like, they were like pharaohs. They controlled everything, and all the directors and actors were just, more or less, kind of under contract and indentured to them. And then when my dad first went to work, he went to work for Lew Wasserman, who ran MCA, and who sort of, I mean, he didn't do it alone. There were other agents who did it too, but he was sort of the key figure in sort of breaking that bond and in kind of shifting the some of the economic power back to the agencies themselves, and by extension to the artists. I mean, he was doing things like, cutting Jimmy Stewart in for profit participation in a movie, right, which was unheard of. That really was something he pioneered. So the studio, so that the power sort of shifted back towards the agencies, and then in the sort of Easy Rider era, there was a moment when it was sort of like the power was a little bit of a free for all, and kind of the young artists had more leverage than they'd ever had before, so they had some power. And then there was CAA in the 70s and 80s, and they definitely had the most power. Suddenly the agencies were kings because it was all about driving up prices for their clients. And then when the studios gained international capital, and when when News Corp bought 20th Century Fox, and Sony bought Columbia TriStar, then all of a sudden it was the studios who were the juggernauts, right? Who had the sort of economic muscle, and kind of watching it move around in that way was just very interesting to me. I thought that was kind of a fascinating key to the kind of the whole story of the movies.
So do you think that kind of whole process strangled a lot of the kind of films that were made in 1969 and in that era?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, it has something to do with the way in which, once the kinds of money that were available in the 90s became, it was that when suddenly, when a kind of top salaries for actors weren't, $2 million or $5 million, but like $15 million or $20 million, and budgets for movies were no longer like, for a studio movie, you wouldn't make a studio movie for $8 million or 15, or if you were really, really gonna spend, 40, suddenly the budgets started, moving into eight not nine-figure sums, hundreds, into the hundreds, and that, I mean, that changes everything. That is the change. That's exactly what happened.
Wow. Yeah. Why do you think and maybe it's the same with other businesses, but I don't know because I only know the film business. Why do you think it's a business that when you get into it, there is no other business, and that you can't imagine anything else, and so you put up with so much?
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I mean, I'm always startled when I meet people who leave. I always feel like that betrays. I mean, obviously there are people who leave because they they just can't really crack it, or they fail at it, and there's no shame in that. That's what happens to most of us in the business. But I think there are people who sometimes do very, very well and then leave. That always astounds me. I think it's hard to leave. I mean, this may no longer be true, but certainly for the longest time, it was such a seductive mix of incredible glamour, right? I mean, and I can remember, even as someone who's always been, even though I've always been inside it, I've always had a little bit of an arm's length removed from it because I just mostly because my ambitions have been and remain elsewhere. It's like I'm trying to write literature, and that's not quite the same as trying to make a movie. But I think it's the combination of enormous amounts of money, very attractive people, very seductive. Sometimes you walk into a meeting sometimes as a writer, and and you have an agent or executive, and they'll just sit there and you feel like they're making the movie in the room with you. They'll be like, oh, it'd be perfect for Leo DiCaprio. They'll yell, hey, can you get Leo on the phone? And you're just thinking, like, you leave and you just think, like, oh my God, like, it's all happening. And then you arrive home and your phone doesn't ring again for a month, and you're like, oh. I fell for it again. I fell for it again. But I also think
you're right about brilliantly when you came back to Hollywood from New York and lived in an apartment next to the Directors Guild, and in view of the very apartment where Fitzgerald died, which is really interesting.
Across the street from it. Yeah. I mean,
right in the heart of Hollywood, if that's not an oxymoron.
Yes. Yes. But, I said to someone the other day, it's like the thing is it is, the business is such that it is forever 2 a.m. at the casino, right? It is just that hour at which you're too invested to quit, or too invested to sort of cut your losses. And you just think, you kind of have to keep playing, even though it's a bad idea.
Yeah. Is that why you seem to, some of the characters you've chosen to write about in Always Crashing, Carol Eastman and they're characters that sort of made it and then kind of disappeared for a while, and maybe for forever as far is that does it surprise you some of those people actually deliberately walked away?
I think they're the sane ones, but okay.
Yeah. I think I think that book I was really just interested in. I've always been interested in and this is I guess a personal interest, because it's certainly my own work is not always going well, and I can go long stretches of time when I'm working on something and failing at it, or it's like I'm not someone who can kind of reliably publish a book a year and just kind of roll from one project to the next. There's always kind of periods of misdirection, and so I did kind of want to delve into people whose paths were irregular, or who kind of had it and then lost it, or who Carol Eastman, a very good example of someone for whom there was just who had one big success and and had a long career out of it, but didn't and that's not the only good movie she ever wrote, but nothing ever matched it in terms of what came out of it. And she was both, I think, in her case, a truly brilliant person, and I don't just mean brilliant in Hollywood terms. Brilliant as a brilliant writer. I've read her journals, and I've read things of hers that were not slated for publication, and she could just write. She could write sentences with the best of them. But also, I think someone who is very, very, very tortured by self-doubt, and and probably spent more time kind of lamenting her unhappiness with either the fact that she wasn't writing, or with the sort of way she felt about what she was writing. That was most of it. And the periods of sort of creative delight were very far apart. And I think some of that is down to one's kind of emotional temperament and makeup and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I remember being before a movie in South Dakota we were sort of taking over a small town. So the producers said, okay, we're giving a party for the town. You must go tonight and you need to be friendly. So I was trying to do my best and talking to a bunch of local people. And they were asking me about how we lived and things like that. And I suddenly realized midway that they were kind of pitying me that I could never make a dinner appointment. I could never make any kind of commitment or anything because I never knew how long we were going to shoot. And it was a funny revelation that, oh, you mean this life that I think is so fantastic is kind of sad to them?
that it's not desirable to everybody else, even if it is desirable to a lot of us. And yeah, it's a, in many ways I find that lovely. Thank God not everybody wants this. And I do think that's also something that I think I was, wondering about and always crashing the same car, which is, first of all, I think that Americans have just the kind of American mythology of success is very, it's just perverse and grotesque and deeply misleading. And, the sorts of people that we valorize as successful people tend to be pretty awful. I think that one needn't look very far at the moment for evidence of that. But I also think that there's something about, I did grow up in this world where even if my parents were, my mother was never really very successful as a screenwriter. My father became enormously successful as a talent agent, but not until I was an adult. But I think even so, I kind of grew up in this world where, expectations were unrealistic, and just the standards, the kind of ambient standards of wealth and prosperity and excess and behavior were not normal. And I don't mean that in a, I think my parents did their best. They were very responsible and really pretty decent people. They were not sort of they were not Hollywood yahoos, kind of, building, 4 swimming pools around their states or whatever. But you can't grow up close to that without in some way being a little bit, having your expectations deformed.
It's interesting. You quote Pauline Kael at one point. She said, Hollywood filmmaking, a tawdry, corrupt art for a tawdry, corrupt world. And you say, she's not wrong. I actually rarely agreed with anything Pauline Kael said about movies.
Neither did I.
It felt like she was just sounding off something she just kind of imagined in the bath and had nothing to do with the movie. But I don't know. I always thought when I started out, I thought a film is kind of a reflection of society. I kind of still think that now. I don't know. Yes.
Yeah, I think in many ways but Pauline Kael is such a weird case because she really was. I always struggled with her too. I grew up in a everybody around me, even when I was in high school, when I was a teenager, everybody was so in love with her, and I just thought, man, I've never seen somebody be so wrong about so many movies. She's so full of shit. But I've developed a sort of greater appreciation for her. I think because she really did sort of she battered at that wall between kind of high art and pop art. And kind of, she didn't have a lot of patience for stuff that was self-consciously highbrow, and she loved, stuff like De Palma, and I think, that even if that's not my own primary inclination as a viewer or an artist, I'm afraid I still have kind of some residual snobism. Some, not too much, a little, but I still think that's such a valuable distinction. In Always Crashing, I wrote about Renata Adler, who, of course, very famously wrote an infamous piece, absolutely demolishing Pauline Kael, a piece I really love, even if I do think it's pretty brutal. And it took me a while to realize that the antipathy between the two of them was class based. That Renata was someone who who'd grown up on the, as something of an East Coast swell, and Pauline was not. And, again, it's like once I saw that, I started to view Pauline Kael a little differently.
Right. Once you know who they are. But I always want the reviewer to admit who they are to me, so I can understand where their opinion's coming from. It's like a documentary filmmaker. I want the filmmaker to be present in the film, so I understand whose point of view I'm looking at. It's
Absolutely.
not reality, as Fred Wiseman says. It's not reality. It's my version of reality. He's making his version of reality. So I need to know the filmmaker to know how to react to the film, which I think you do on features when you get to know a filmmaker like Sam Peckinpah, who was, to me, God. I mean, you understand where he's coming from. You understand why those lines are there and why those pauses are in the movie,
It's funny, just to square the circle on this, I just was reading an interview with Peckinpah, an old Playboy magazine interview from the 70s, and they asked him about something that Pauline had said, that Kael had said about him, she had compared him to Norman Mailer, and it was something about their kind of various relationships to machismo, and he said something that he said, why, I love Pauline Kael, she's a good old gal, and I've enjoyed going out drinking with her on occasion, but she's really cracking walnuts with her ass with this one. And I thought, that is the best. I don't even know what it means, but it is the best Peckinpah. It is such a fabulous. What a thing to say. Anyway, God bless Sam Peckinpah. Yeah, he's a god to me too.
Yeah. I want to ask a bit more about your writing.
Yes.
Fitzgerald said, writers aren't people exactly, or if they're any good, they're a whole bunch of people trying hard to be one person. Do you see yourself in that quote?
I do. I mean, not literally. I certainly am one person, one in some sense, self-disappointing person. but I do think that there is something about, I don't know, I feel like, the world that we live in now is very, very, very dense with opinions, forcefully expressed, and I think we kind of live in a world where everybody just wants to kind of pummel you with their opinion. And I often think that I often don't know my opinions, and I'm so interested in, I can remember, I don't know that I want to name the writer in this case, but a couple of years ago, I was asked to do the Los Angeles Library kind of called me in a panic because they had a writer, a sort of well-known, a writer of a very, very, very then enormously popular novel coming to speak, and the person who they were supposed to speak with dropped out. So they said, we need someone to, and I had read the novel and very much disliked it. And yet what I remember thinking is, I think I should do this because it would give me an opportunity to read the novel again as if I were a person who liked it. And it wasn't like I thought the book was, trash or whatever. I just didn't like it. Yeah. And so I went back to it, and it wasn't like, I had this epiphany, like I loved it. I don't know that I really liked it the second time either, but I did. We had this great conversation, and I think the writer in question had no idea that I was not, had not been very responsive to their book. And I liked doing that. I liked kind of placing my kind of adopting an alternate critical viewpoint for myself. And I think, that there's something in that I think is I think that fiction writers usually have that, that kind of ability to see things from another perspective. In The Golden Hour, which is, definitionally not a novel, but I kind of consider it to be one. I mean, it's, if it's a memoir, it's a very strange one insofar as much of it is, told from the perspectives and from inside the heads of people who are, not me. And some of those people are even people that I've never even met. But, that sense of entering into other consciousness, or, entering into the mind of Lou Wasserman, sympathetically, entering into the mind of James Baldwin, of all kinds of people was my favorite part of doing it. And I think that's kind of what Fitzgerald meant. I think he was gesturing towards that.
I think that what really comes across in your writing for me is not only your love-hate relationship with Hollywood and the rest of the world, but that you're trying to understand it. You're trying to get into Lew Wasserman's head, because you can't, hell, if you can't understand the character, and you're just trying to find it. And you write like almost like it's Raymond Chandler sort of novel. There's this kind of like detective there, kind of, and it is a sort of noirish tale. You conjure up a Hollywood that at one part is kind of almost glamorous in this dark film noir way. But, it's the love you have for it comes out. That the reason you came back here.
I think that's even why, in many respects, I even opted to write about it. I think when I started, it was not part of my plan to write about Hollywood or the movies, as I've now done in multiple books, and thankfully the next book I'm going to give myself a bit of a break. But I ultimately decided to do it for two reasons. I mean, one, because it was the world that, not just the world that I knew, but a world about which I did have very complicated feelings. I knew that I loved it, and I knew that I also found it intolerable. And I also knew, and this was important, that everything else I read about it tended to look at it in a light that didn't seem complete to me. Even the stuff that's very, very good. I'm a big fan of Michael Tolkin's work and of The Player. I mean, I love both the novel and the film, and it's both enormously accurate and, of course, but one wouldn't call it loving. And and in some ways, I think that kind of partiality to me, I just thought, there's another aspect to this story, and it's not as if I feel that this world and these people are wonderful examples of human decency. They certainly aren't, but that does exist, believe it or not. Human decency does exist in Hollywood, or at least it did. Maybe not in profusion, but in meaningful pockets. And I think that seemed worth recording in some way. And I just figured, well, it's writers do tend to kind of plow the ground they're given, right? And I thought, well, if Philip Roth can get 23 books about Newark out of Newark, and Toni Morrison can get 5 or 6 out of Lorain, Ohio, I can probably I can do my best.
I was really interested. Also, you talk about the relationship of films and time. Do you get lost in movies?
All the time.
You say you go into a movie and you actually live days or weeks, but only in the space of 2 hours, maybe 3 these days.
Yeah.
Movies getting longer and longer. But how do you feel about that? Is it?
I love it. I mean, I think, look, this is something that I think all art forms, every last one of them, I sometimes think their primary function is to mediate our experience of time, or our experience of consciousness in time. And I think that's true with music. I think that's true with literature. I think film, which is, what didn't Tarkovsky call it? Sculpting in time. That's what it is. And that seems, and there too, and particularly with The Golden Hour, I remember just having that realization in the middle. I thought, this is a book it's about time. It's actually, but the actual subject of the book is not the movies, it is time. And, and I think that is sort of, it's certainly ground zero for literature. I think that the best novels I know are about time, and that not just Proust, but most of them. And so, it seemed, but also, of course, the movies are just so remarkable in that way, because they can cover, because they have a temporal economy. You can't read you can't read most novels in 2 hours, right? But you can have a complete cinematic experience in even less than that, right? We watch a lot of old, Colombian noirs or whatnot that are, sometimes you'll be like, wow, it's 75 minutes long and it's perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
You can get 3 movies in an afternoon instead of only one with an interval. How do you feel about the way movies have changed? I mean, it's the way we get our entertainment. I don't like the word art, but if you could call filmmaking art in some way, fine.
Yeah.
But it's changing, obviously, and streaming and, Netflix series. And how do you feel about that? Because that's a different relationship with time. When you've got a long-running series and like there's an episode every week, I mean, you can get them all at the end and then you kind of binge watch them all at night, like we're prone to do with sort of Scandinavian noir. But if you're, it's a different sense of time, isn't it? How do you feel about that?
It depends. It depends on it really depends on the show. I think that there was a brief moment and that moment is over, but, a moment, where certainly in America, and obviously I actually had this experience. I remember in the 90s seeing The Singing Detective, and being kind of knocked out by it. There were, The Sopranos or my wife and I are just in the middle of rewatching Mad Men. And, these shows that are really, really artful in their kind of narrative, in their long form narrative construction. They're not these things that exist just to be sort of stretched into oblivion. They're you can see how they were created and ideated and overseen by someone with a sort of comprehensive narrative and thematic vision. That's one thing. I think they're not movies. It's a different medium, but they are the best of those are as wonderful as movies to me. But I think now and increasingly particularly with the streamers, it's like that's not really what happens. Streamers will commission a show, they'll air a show, and there'll be a season or 2 seasons, and they will they will pull the plug in the middle of it, or conversely, they will sort of the creators will sort of keep it. It's like a piece of gum or something. They'll just keep trying to stretch it as far as they can do it, so that they can keep it on the air. And that to me is sort of the difference between television and content. Right. You abhor, you dislike the word art. I really dislike the word content. and yet I think that's what those things are. And even when they are artful, and I'm thinking of, a show that's very popular here at the moment, which is Severance. I think that's like a very, very interestingly conceived, very intelligent, fascinating, and deeply frustrating piece of content. I don't think it's a piece of art. I don't think it's great television. I've sort of stuck with it under duress because my wife really likes it, and but I just keep thinking this is lame because it doesn't have a sense of an ending. And I think in the end, somehow that's what makes that's a big part of what makes the distinction, is a sense of shape.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times when you're watching some of these streamers, at least I do when I'm watching it, I go, oh, they've padded this because they've got to make this hour because they need 8 of them. Oh, they've padded this because they already told us this. And I'm just so aware. And it's a need that they seem to have because they want to fill a time slot. But
it all started with that documentary series we watched that we really like called Wild Wild Country, about this cult up in Oregon.
Yes,
and
of course.
It would have made a wonderful 90 minutes, but it's like we're watching like 6 hours or whatever it was.
It was.
And
that drives me crazy.
Yeah.
It is a shame. It is a shame. That's exactly right. And I guess that goes back to that question of time, right? Where somehow duration is not a function of the narrative being told. Duration becomes something that the narrative is being asked to fill.
Right.
That's
well put,
right.
Yeah.
And that's probably always true. I mean, I think even in those shows that were really great, like Deadwood, or that there's still sometimes a sense of duration being padded, but not always, and not very much. Not with the really good ones.
You always want to wait for the director's cut, because the director's going to do shortened version that's really what it's about,
maybe,
rather than what there's
Yeah, maybe.
instead of like in the movies, they always want to do a longer version because the producers or studio won't let them have the length.
One film that always kind of delights me with by turning that inside out a little bit is Killing of a Chinese Bookie, because of course there are the two cuts of that, right? There's the long cut and there's the shorter cut, and it's actually the shorter cut that Cassavetes preferred. And that I actually think is better. I actually do think that version is better. And it's strange that, I feel like that's a real anomaly. Like, what do you mean the director prefers the shorter version that's whittled a little further? Yeah.
Yeah. It goes back to what you were saying, though, that beware of being granted everything possible. Bob Rafelson used to say that. He said the worst thing you can have is the studio say you can have anything you want.
Yeah.
You've got nothing to push back up. Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He said, then you've got nothing to push back against, and you've got no excuse either.
That's a very very wise move.
Yeah.
I wish I had a chance to know him. I know Toby. I know his former wife. She lives up the block from me, and I see her sometimes. I adore her, but I only wish I had, because I do think he is was such a magnificent, just a fabulous filmmaker, and even on the strength of just those first couple of movies alone, deserves a spot in Valhalla.
Yeah, I'm with you.
He was a funny guy, though, because everybody always would talk about how difficult he was, but you loved him.
He hit the producer on Brubaker, and dailies.
Yeah.
You don't comment on my dailies. Whack. He was a gentle giant to me.
I like that. That's lovely.
Yeah, we had a wonderful time wandering around Africa.
I can imagine. Good Lord. Yeah.
Oh, well. What have we left out? I mean, everybody should read your books.
Yeah.
I mean, not just Gold now. You want to know about the film industry in Hollywood. But it's a wonderful read. Even if you're not into movies, it's a wonderful read.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for writing them. That must to be part of this.
Bless you. I will say it's been very, the nicest thing about, I started writing, really very intently when I was about 25, and I didn't publish anything until I didn't publish anything until I was 40. I didn't publish anything anybody really read until I was 50. And it's really only in the last few years that I have this kind of sense of a kind of, very, very passionate readership. And it is the loveliest thing. And, I'm always, I think you grow up in the movie business and you witness a lot of kind of fake humility from artists, right? I've seen a lot of Academy Award speeches, and it's fairly rare that those people are actually humbled by anything. But in my case, I actually feel this kind of genuine sense of delight and astonishment that these books mean anything to anybody and are read by other people.
Isn't it interesting though that so many people today, that they think they're over the hill if they haven't. I mean, as a cinematographer, if you haven't shot a film by you're 25, you're over the hill. You're never going to make it. I didn't shoot a movie that anybody else saw till I was like 40. I think, come on.
Yeah. Well, I
and
think
then it really means something when you do it, doesn't it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. When I was young, and it was funny because I was always I had any number of friends who were hugely successful, at a very young age. Bret Easton Ellis being a perfect example of that, right? Just someone who wrote a book in high school, before he was even out of university. He was quite famous. And I remember thinking when I was that age, I thought, well, I don't really want to do that. I don't really have the experience, to write the kind of books that I most admire and that I most like. I'm too young, and that in no way is that a denigration of Bret's work, which I love and always have. But it was just, for myself, I thought I really wanted to write with a little bit more, age and kind of density of perception in there. And I think even for a while that was confusing. When I wrote my first novel and I gave it to my then agent, and she said to me, I don't know whether I should send this to your peer group or my peer group, who were all much older. And I thought that was a kind of fascinating, it was one frustration among many that I had in that experience, but it was still, it told me something about what I was trying at that time unsuccessfully to do.
Well, you've done it well.
I'm really glad you did it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah,
it's been really great.
It's my pleasure. Anytime, it's really an honor to be a part of this. So thank you for having me.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.